The hall was decorated with lavish golden drapes, white roses lined the aisle, and the chandelier lights cast a warm glow over the guests who whispered excitedly amongst themselves. It was supposed to be a perfect wedding, one that would be remembered for its grandeur, its beauty, and the love between the groom and bride. But in reality, this day would be remembered for something far more shocking. Ethan stood at the altar, his face carefully composed, though his hands were slightly clammy. He adjusted his cufflinks, his heart pounding beneath his crisp black tuxedo. Today he was marrying Sophia, a woman he had fallen for quickly, a woman who had at one point been his wife's best friend. A woman who had promised him a fresh start, one without the complications of his past. He had convinced himself that what he was doing was right. Love was complicated, wasn't it? People outgrew each other. Feelings changed. He wasn't the villain. At least that's what he kept telling himself. But as the music started playing and Sophia began walking down the aisle in a gown that shimmered under the warm lights, a gnawing sense of unease crept up his spine. He brushed it off. Today was the beginning of his new life. Then, just as the officiant cleared his throat to begin, the grand doors of the hall burst open. A gasp swept through the crowd as Isla, Ethan's heavily pregnant wife, strode inside. Her face was unreadable, her eyes stormy. Clutched tightly in her trembling hand were divorce papers, and the tension in the room became suffocating. Ethan's blood turned to ice. His worst nightmare had just walked in, wearing a fierce expression that made it clear, she was here for war. Months ago, Ethan and Isla had been what everyone considered the perfect couple. They had been together for 6 years, surviving ups and downs that tested their love. Isla had always been his safe place, the woman who understood him better than anyone. But things had changed when Isla became pregnant. Ethan had started withdrawing, claiming he felt suffocated by the impending responsibility. He needed space. He needed time to think. That was when Sophia, Isla's best friend, came into the picture like a serpent in paradise. She had always been there, lingering in the background, whispering in his ear about how some people change when they get married, how some women trap men with children, how love shouldn't be forced. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan had let himself believe those words. It had started with late-night conversations. Then a stolen kiss. Then an affair that spiraled out of control. When Isla found out, she had begged him to reconsider. "We built this life together," she had cried, her hands resting protectively over her belly. "How could you throw it all away?" Ethan's response had been cold. "I'm not ready for this, Isla. I can't be who you want me to be." And just like that he left. Not just Isla, but the child growing inside her. Not long after, he announced his engagement to Sophia. Back at the wedding, Isla's heels clicked against the polished floor as she approached the altar, her sheer presence causing a suffocating silence to fall over the hall. Sophia gripped Ethan's arm, her face pale, her eyes darting between him and Isla. Ethan finally managed to croak, his throat dry. "I'm sorry, am I interrupting something?" Isla's voice was cool, deceptively calm, though her eyes burned with betrayal. Murmurs broke out among the guests. Some of them had heard whispers of Ethan's past relationship, but not this. Not that he had abandoned his pregnant wife to marry her best friend. "I thought I'd drop by to deliver a wedding gift," Isla continued, holding up the crisp white envelope in her hand. Then with a swift motion she threw the divorce papers onto Ethan's chest. Gasps echoed throughout the hall. Ethan's fingers trembled as he caught the papers, his face draining of color. He barely had time to react before Isla's hand swung through the air, landing a sharp slap across his cheek. A collective gasp filled the hall. "That," Isla said, her voice shaking with emotion, "is for every night I cried myself to sleep wondering what I did to deserve this." Sophia's grip on Ethan tightened, her eyes wide with panic. "Isla, you." Isla snapped, her gaze cutting into Sophia like a blade. "You were my best friend. I trusted you with everything. And you," her voice cracked slightly but she quickly steadied herself, "you stole the man I thought I would spend forever with. You encouraged him to walk away from our baby." Sophia flinched. "I never meant." "Save it," Isla said sharply. "I came here for closure. I came here to remind you both that betrayal doesn't go unnoticed. And most importantly, Isla placed a hand over her belly, her expression shifting into something stronger, unbreakable. I came here to remind myself that I don't need a man who would abandon his own child. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. As Isla turned on her heel, walking back through the same door she had come through, the crowd remained in stunned silence. But then, one guest started clapping. Then another. And another. Until the entire hall was filled with the sound of applause. Ethan stood frozen, his face burning with humiliation. Sophia's hands shook as she realized that their perfect wedding had just been reduced to a scandalous disaster. Isla. She walked out of that wedding with her head held high, her dignity intact and her future wide open. She may have lost a man that day, but in doing so she had gained something far more powerful, her self-respect and a new beginning. The heavy doors of the wedding hall slammed shut behind Isla, her breath shaky but steady. The applause from the guests still echoed in her ears as she stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against her heated skin. For the first time in months she felt free. She had walked into that wedding with nothing but heartbreak and rage, yet she had left with something far more powerful, her dignity intact and her head held high. But even as she stood outside, the reality of everything hit her like a tidal wave. She was alone. Pregnant and alone. A painful lump formed in her throat, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not now. Not after what she had just done. From inside the hall, voices rose in panic and confusion. The once perfect wedding was now in shambles. And Isla knew that the real storm was just beginning. Back in the hall, the chaos was unbearable. Ethan stood frozen at the altar, his hands clenched around the crumpled divorce papers. His cheek still stung from Isla's slap, but the humiliation burned far deeper. He had never expected her to show up. He had assumed she would suffer in silence, that she would accept his choice and disappear quietly into the shadows. But instead she had stolen the spotlight, his spotlight. The whispers of the guests were deafening. Did you know he was married before? She's pregnant with his child. How could he do that? And to her best friend? That's disgusting. Ethan's heart pounded as he turned towards Sophia, his so-called bride, who stood beside him looking absolutely pale. Her hands trembled as she stared at the doors Isla had just walked out of, shock and shame written all over her face. Sophia, Ethan hissed, reaching for her arm. Say something. But Sophia jerked away. Are you kidding me, Ethan? You never told me she was coming. You said she was out of the picture. She was, he snapped, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. I didn't think she'd. You didn't think. You just let your pregnant wife walk in here and humiliate us in front of everyone. More whispers. More judgmental stares. Sophia's parents, who had once looked at Ethan with pride, now glared at him with nothing but disgust. This wedding is over, Sophia's father spat. Wait, no, Ethan tried, but it was too late. The officiant had already stepped back. The wedding guests were already shuffling toward the exit, eager to escape the wreckage. And Sophia? She ripped off her veil, threw it at Ethan's feet and stormed off. Just like that, everything Ethan had left Isla for came crashing down. Meanwhile, Isla sat in the back of a cab, her hands gently placed over her belly as she stared out at the city lights. She had spent the last few months drowning in pain, letting the betrayal consume her. But now she felt something different. She felt stronger. No more tears. No more waiting for Ethan to come back and realize what he lost. He had made his choice. And now she would make hers. When the cab pulled up to her apartment, Isla stepped out, a sense of finality settling over her. As she climbed the stairs, she couldn't help but glance at the place where Ethan's car used to be parked. The empty space reminded her of everything that had once been there, but also of what was gone for good. She was about to head inside when a voice stopped her. Isla. She turned, her eyes widening in shock. Liam had been Ethan's best man. Or at least he was supposed to be. But unlike Ethan, Liam had a conscience. He had been one of the few people who had warned Ethan not to leave Isla, who had disapproved of his actions from the start. And now he was standing here, looking at her with an expression of something close to regret. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Isla let out a small, humorless laugh. "Do I look okay?" Liam hesitated before shaking his head. "No. But you look like someone who finally knows her worth." Isla blinked at him, surprised by his words. For the longest time she had felt like nothing. Ethan had stripped her of her confidence, had made her question whether she was even deserving of love. But tonight had changed that. She had worth. And she didn't need Ethan or anyone else to validate that. "Thanks, Liam," she murmured, brushing past him to head inside. But as she shut the door, she couldn't help but feel a tiny flicker of curiosity. Why had he come? And more importantly, why did he care? Meanwhile, Ethan sat alone in his now empty apartment, his hands running through his disheveled hair. His phone buzzed with missed calls and messages. Some from Sophia, most from furious guests who wanted nothing to do with him anymore. But none of that mattered. The only thing he could think about was Isla. Her face when she had slapped him. The strength in her voice when she told him she didn't need him anymore. For the first time since he walked out on her, a sinking realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had made a mistake. A terrible mistake. And now it was too late. The next morning, Isla woke up feeling lighter than she had in months. She brewed herself a cup of coffee, enjoying the quiet morning as she placed a hand over her belly. "You and me, little one," she whispered, a small smile tugging at her lips. "We're going to be just fine." A knock at the door startled her. Frowning, she set down her coffee and made her way over, half expecting it to be her nosy neighbor. But when she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Because standing there, looking nervous and uncertain, was Liam. "I know this is unexpected," he said quickly, rubbing the back of his neck. "But, can we talk?" Isla narrowed her eyes. "Talk about what?" He hesitated for a moment before meeting her gaze. "About Ethan. And about what he's about to do next." A sense of dread curled in Isla's stomach. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. Liam exhaled slowly. "He wants you back." Isla's heart stuttered, but before she could say anything, Liam took a step forward, his expression more intense than she had ever seen. "But I need you to know something, Isla. He doesn't deserve you. And if you give him another chance, he'll break you all over again." The weight of his words settled between them, thick and heavy. And for the first time since Ethan walked out on her, Isla found herself wondering, was it really over? Or was this just the beginning of another storm? The morning air was crisp, but inside Isla's apartment the atmosphere was tense. Liam stood in the doorway, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his eyes locked onto hers with a silent urgency. "You heard me, Isla," he said again. "Ethan wants you back." Isla's heart clenched, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had expected this. Ethan had always been the kind of man who only realized what he had after it was gone. She folded her arms across her chest. "And why exactly are you telling me this?" Liam hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward. "Because I don't think you should go back to him." Isla let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "That's not your decision to make, Liam." "I know," he admitted, his voice softer now. "But I don't want to see you hurt again." Something in his tone made her pause. There was genuine concern in his eyes. Not pity, not obligation, just raw, unfiltered concern. But before she could reply, her phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Ethan. "Ethan, we need to talk. Please, Isla. I made a mistake." She let out a slow breath, ignoring the way her pulse quickened. She knew this moment was coming, but she wasn't sure if she was ready. Liam saw the change in her expression and sighed. "You're considering it, aren't you?" Isla frowned, placing her phone down. "I don't know." "Then let me remind you why you left him in the first place," Liam said, stepping closer. "He left you. He abandoned you when you needed him the most. He doesn't deserve a second chance, Isla." His words were harsh, but they were true. And yet, a part of her still felt the pull of unfinished business. He had loved Ethan. For 6 years he had been her world. It wasn't easy to erase that kind of history, no matter how much she wished it was. "I just need to hear him out," she whispered. Liam exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. Then I hope you're ready for whatever lie he feeds you next. A few hours later, Isla found herself sitting across from Ethan in a quiet cafe, her hands gripping a warm cup of tea as she studied him carefully. He looked different. Disheveled. Restless. Like a man who had lost everything. "Thank you for meeting me," he said quietly, his fingers tapping anxiously on the table. "I need answers," Isla said, her voice firm. "What do you want, Ethan?" He sighed, leaning forward. "I want to fix things. I made a mistake, Isla. A huge mistake. I should have never left you. I let my fear control me and I ruined the best thing that ever happened to me." Isla swallowed hard. "And Sophia?" Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. "She was a mistake too. I thought I wanted freedom, but what I really wanted was you. I was just too stupid to realize it at the time." She clenched her jaw. How convenient. Now that Sophia had abandoned him, now that his so-called new life had crumbled to dust, he suddenly wanted her back? "You didn't just leave me, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "You left our child. You didn't even look back." Ethan's face twisted with pain. "I know. And I regret it every day. But I'm here now. I want to be a father. I want to be in our child's life, in your life." Her heart pounded. Part of her had dreamed of hearing these words for months. But was it real? Or was it just guilt? She searched his face for answers, but before she could say anything, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor caught her attention. She turned her head, her breath hitched. Liam stood at the entrance of the cafe, his eyes locked onto hers. Liam's presence changed everything. His gaze flickered toward Ethan, and in an instant, Isla saw the tension rise between them. "You've got some nerve showing up here," Ethan said coldly. Liam crossed his arms, unfazed. "And you've got some nerve asking for another chance after what you did." Ethan's jaw tightened. "This isn't your business, Liam." Liam's lips curled into a smirk. "That's where you're wrong. Isla is my business now." A sharp silence fell over the table. Isla's breath caught in her throat. What was he saying? Ethan's eyes darkened. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Liam stepped closer. "It means I actually care about her. Unlike you, I never abandoned her. I never made her feel like she wasn't enough." Ethan shot up from his seat, his fists clenched. "You think you can just step in and replace me?" "I don't have to replace you," Liam shot back. "Because you already lost her." Isla stood up quickly, placing a hand on Liam's arm before things escalated further. "Liam, stop," she said softly. He glanced at her, his expression softening. "I just don't want you to make a mistake, Isla. You deserve more than this." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "And you think you can give her that?" Liam didn't hesitate. "Yes." The air grew thick with unspoken words. Ethan looked at Isla, desperation in his eyes. "Tell me you don't feel the same way. Tell me you don't still love me." Her heart slammed against her ribs. Did she? Or had she simply been holding on to the past because it was easier than facing an uncertain future? Her eyes flickered toward Liam. For months he had been there. He had been the only one who checked in on her, the only one who stood by her side when Ethan walked away. And suddenly Isla realized something. Ethan may have been the man she once loved, but Liam was the man who had shown her what real love looked like. Taking a deep breath, she met Ethan's gaze. "You're right about one thing, Ethan," she said. "I did love you. But I don't anymore." Ethan flinched like she had struck him. Liam exhaled slowly, relief flashing across his face. And just like that, the past lost its hold on her. As Ethan stormed out of the cafe, Isla felt lighter. She turned to Liam, who watched her carefully. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I think I am." He hesitated before reaching for her hand. "I meant what I said back there." She met his gaze, searching for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. "You don't have to rush into anything," he added quickly. "I just want you to know that I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." Isla smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in a long time she felt safe. She squeezed his hand gently. "Maybe it's time for a new story." Liam chuckled. "Yeah. What kind of story?" She smiled, feeling her baby kick inside her. One where I finally choose myself. And this time she knew she had made the right choice. The air outside the cafe was crisp, carrying the soft hum of the city's evening life. Isla took a deep breath, her heart still pounding from what had just happened inside. The moment Ethan walked away, a weight lifted off her shoulders, a weight she hadn't even realized she was still carrying. For months she had been haunted by the past, by the what-ifs, by the aching question of whether Ethan would ever regret leaving her. Now she had her answer. But as she turned toward Liam, who was still standing beside her, she realized something else. She was free. For the first time in a long time she felt in control of her life again. That was intense, Liam said, rubbing the back of his neck as they walked away from the cafe. Isla let out a breathy laugh. That's an understatement. He glanced at her, eyes searching. How do you feel? He thought about it. Months ago she would have crumbled under the weight of Ethan's return. She would have replayed his words in her mind, wondering if she should give him another chance, wondering if she could forgive him. But now she felt strong. I feel like I finally closed a chapter one should have ended a long time ago, she admitted. And I feel relieved. Liam smiled at that. Good. You deserve relief, Isla. She turned to him, hesitating for a moment. Why do you care so much? Liam stopped walking, shoving his hands into his pockets. Because I know what it feels like to lose yourself in someone who doesn't deserve you. Isla frowned. You do. He nodded, looking past her as if recalling a memory. I was in love once. Thought she was my forever. But it wasn't. His jaw tightened slightly before he exhaled. It took me a long time to realize that just because you love someone doesn't mean they're meant for you. Isla's chest tightened. He understood that now. She had loved Ethan with every fiber of her being, but he hadn't been meant for her. Not in the way a real, lasting love should be. As they continued walking, Liam's fingers brushed against hers just slightly. It was so subtle that Isla wasn't sure if it was an accident or if he had meant to do it. Either way, she didn't pull away. And neither did he. A few days later, Isla sat in a small doctor's office, her hands gently resting on her belly as she waited for the ultrasound technician to come in. It still felt surreal sometimes, knowing that a tiny life was growing inside her. A life that, for months, she had been preparing to raise alone. She had no regrets about choosing to keep the baby, but part of her had always feared how she would do it. Would she be enough? Would her child miss having a father? The sound of the door opening pulled her from her thoughts. Hey, a deep voice said. Isla's head snapped up, her heart skipping a beat. Liam stood in the doorway, looking slightly sheepish. I hope it's okay that I'm here, he said. I just thought maybe you'd want some company. Warmth spread through her chest. It was more than okay. Yeah, she said softly. I'd like that. As Liam took a seat beside her, the technician entered, greeting them both before starting the ultrasound. And when the screen flickered to life, showing a tiny heartbeat, Isla felt tears prick at her eyes. Liam watched silently, his expression unreadable. Then after a moment he whispered, "That's amazing." Isla smiled, placing a hand over his. For the first time in a long time she realized something. She wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, she never had to be again. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan was unraveling. His apartment was a mess, clothes scattered, half-empty bottles lining the counter. He hadn't been able to focus since Isla rejected him. He had expected her to waver, to hesitate, to at least consider giving him another chance. Instead she had chosen Liam. The thought made his stomach churn with fury. Liam had been his best man, his friend. How dare he swoop in like some kind of savior? How dare he act like he was the one who deserved Isla? Ethan took another swig of whiskey, his mind buzzing. He wasn't going to let this happen. He wouldn't just lose Isla. He wouldn't let her erase him from her life so easily. And as an idea began forming in his mind, a slow, bitter smile stretched across his face. If Isla thought she could move on without him, she had another thing coming. Later that evening, Isla sat in her apartment, her thoughts swirling. She kept replaying the moment in the doctor's office, the way Liam had looked at her baby with something close to awe. Could she really let herself trust someone again? As if sensing her thoughts, a knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, Liam stood there looking hesitant. "Hey," she said, surprised. "Everything okay?" He ran a hand through his hair. I needed to say something." Isla stepped aside, letting him in. For a long moment he didn't speak. He just looked at her, his jaw clenched as if he was debating something. Then he exhaled. "I know you've been through hell, Isla. And the last thing I want is to complicate things for you." Her brows furrowed. "Liam. But I need you to know something," he interrupted. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I care about you," he said, voice raw. "More than I probably should. And I don't want to stand on the sidelines anymore, pretending like I don't." Isla's heart pounded. "Liam. I'm not saying this to pressure you," he continued. I need you to know that whatever happens, I'm here. For you. For the baby. No matter what." A lump formed in her throat. She had spent so long believing she had to do this alone. Believing that no one would want to be there for her. But Liam was offering. And more than that, she wanted him to. Slowly she reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Thank you," she whispered. He smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "You don't have to thank me. You just have to let me stay." And for the first time, Isla let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was finally getting the love she deserved. But as she smiled at Liam, neither of them knew that outside, sitting in a parked car across the street, Ethan was watching. His fists clenched as jealousy and rage boiled in his veins. If Isla thought she could move on from him so easily, he was dead wrong. The night air was thick with silence as Ethan sat in his parked car, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Through the dim glow of Isla's apartment window he could see her inside, smiling. With Liam. The sight sent a sharp stab of rage through his chest. That should be him in there. Not Liam. Isla was his. Or at least she used to be. Ethan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He had lost everything, his wife, his best friend, and the future he had once taken for granted. But he wasn't done fighting. He refused to believe that Isla had really moved on. He refused to let Liam win. And if Isla wouldn't listen to him, well, he'd just have to make her. The next morning, Isla woke up to the scent of coffee wafting through her apartment. Blinking the sleep from her eyes, she slowly sat up, stretching as she glanced toward the kitchen. Liam stood at the counter, 2 mugs in hand. "You're up," he said with a small smile, setting one down in front of her. She returned the smile, warmth spreading in her chest. "You made coffee?" Liam shrugged. "Figured you could use some." She took a slow sip, savoring the taste. For the first time in months, Isla felt at peace. No overwhelming heartbreak. No fear of the future. Just a quiet morning with someone who genuinely cared about her. Felt right. But as much as she wanted to hold on to that moment, an uneasiness gnawed at her. Ethan wasn't the kind of man to give up so easily. And a part of her feared that last night wasn't the last time she would see him. He was right. Later that afternoon, as she stepped outside to check her mail, a familiar figure was waiting for her. Ethan. Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You shouldn't be here," she said, gripping her mailbox door tightly. Ethan gave her a half smile, one that once would have made her weak. But now it just made her feel uneasy. "I just want to talk," he said, taking a slow step forward. Isla shook her head. "We already talked, Ethan. There's nothing left to say." "Isla, please." His voice wavered slightly. "I can't stop thinking about you. About us. About everything we had." She sighed, rubbing her temple. "You mean that everything you threw away?" Ethan flinched, but he recovered quickly. "I made a mistake. I know that now. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but Isla," he took another step forward, his eyes pleading. "I still love you." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You don't love me, Ethan. You love the idea of me. You love the control you had over me." His expression darkened slightly. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" she challenged, folding her arms. "If you really loved me, you wouldn't have walked away when I needed you the most. You wouldn't have left me to deal with this pregnancy alone. Ethan's jaw tightened. I was scared. That's not an excuse. For a moment they stood there in tense silence. Then Ethan exhaled sharply, his desperation turning into something colder. So that's it, he asked. You're just going to throw everything away because of one mistake? One mistake. Isla scoffed. You didn't just cheat, Ethan. You abandoned me. You abandoned our child. There's no coming back from that. His gaze flickered toward her belly, and for the first time, there was something unreadable in his eyes. Are you really sure about that? He asked. The way he said it, the quiet threat hidden beneath the words, sent a chill down her spine. But before she could respond, the sound of footsteps approaching made her turn. His expression hardened the moment he saw Ethan standing too close to Isla. You need to leave, Liam said, his voice firm. Ethan's lips curled into a bitter smirk. Here comes the knight in shining armor. Liam ignored the taunt. She told you no. So walk away before this gets ugly. A muscle twitched in Ethan's jaw. But after a long moment he exhaled and stepped back. Fine, he said. But don't think this is over, Isla. She swallowed hard, watching as he turned and disappeared down the street. Liam placed a protective hand on her arm. Are you okay? Isla nodded slowly, but deep down something about the way Ethan had looked at her belly, left an uneasy feeling in her gut. This wasn't over. A few days passed without any sign of Ethan, and Isla started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had finally given up. But then one night, Liam showed up at her apartment with a grim expression. You need to see this, he said, handing her his phone. Isla frowned, scrolling through the screen. And what she saw made her blood run cold. It was a legal document. Filed by Ethan. A petition for paternal rights. He's trying to take the baby, Liam said, his voice edged with anger. Isla's hands trembled as she clutched the phone. Ethan wasn't coming back for her. He was coming back for her child. The next morning, Isla sat across from a lawyer in a small office, her heart hammering as she explained everything that had happened. I want to fight this, she said, voice firm. I won't let him take my baby. The lawyer nodded. You have a strong case, Isla. He abandoned you during the pregnancy. He has no stable job or home. A judge will take that into account. But Ethan's manipulative, she said. And he knows how to make himself look like the victim. The lawyer sighed. Then we prepare for a fight. Isla swallowed hard. She had never wanted this. Never wanted to battle Ethan in court. But she would do whatever it took to protect her child. She wouldn't let Ethan win. As she left the office, Liam was waiting for her outside. He studied her face, concern etched into his features. What did they say? Slaw exhaled. That I have a good chance. But it won't be easy. Liam nodded, then without hesitation he took her hand. You won't do this alone, he said. I promise you. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away. For so long she had believed she had to fight every battle alone. But now she had someone standing beside her. And for the first time in a long time she believed she could win. The morning of the court hearing arrived faster than Isla expected. She sat in the small legal office, her fingers curled tightly around the edges of her chair, her heart thumping in her chest. Liam sat beside her, his presence grounding her, his warmth a silent reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. You okay? He asked softly, his hand resting just beside hers. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. I have to be. She had spent months preparing for this day, for the battle that Ethan had forced upon her. Ethan wasn't just fighting for his so-called rights, he was fighting for control. For revenge. But Isla wasn't that scared, broken woman anymore. She was going to fight back. For herself. For her child. And for the future she was finally ready to claim. The courtroom was cold, sterile, and filled with quiet murmurs. Ethan sat across the room, his arrogance carefully masked beneath a neatly pressed suit and a rehearsed look of regret. He had always been good at lying. And today he had come prepared. My client only seeks to be involved in his child's life, Ethan's lawyer said smoothly, his voice echoing through the courtroom. He regrets his past mistakes, But abandonment was never his intention. He simply needed time to process the pregnancy, and now he is ready to step up as a father. Isla clenched her fists. Time to process? Ethan had walked away. He had left her when she needed him the most without a second thought. And now he wanted to rewrite the narrative? Her lawyer stood, adjusting her glasses. Your Honor, my client was left to navigate pregnancy alone. She was emotionally and financially abandoned. This is not about a father who was struggling. This is about a man who made a conscious decision to walk away and is now seeking control because the woman he left has moved on. Ethan shifted in his seat, but he kept his calm facade. I made mistakes, he said, finally standing to address the judge. I admit that. But I love my child. And I should have the chance to be in their life. Isla's stomach churned. The judge studied both parties carefully before speaking. Does the father have stable employment? Ethan's lawyer hesitated. No, Your Honor, the lawyer admitted. However, he is actively seeking work. The judge turned to Isla's lawyer. And the mother? Ms. Rivera has maintained steady employment, is financially independent, and has prepared a stable home for her child, her lawyer said firmly. The judge nodded. And is the father listed on the birth certificate? Isla's heartbeat quickened. Her baby hadn't been born yet. The hospital forms were waiting to be filled, and she still had the power to decide. I have not made that decision yet, she said, her voice clear and steady. Ethan's eyes darkened. You can't just erase me, he said through clenched teeth. Isla met his gaze, unflinching. You erased yourself when you walked away, she replied. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Carter, while I appreciate your desire to be involved, your actions up to this point do not demonstrate readiness for parental responsibility. Ethan's jaw clenched. The judge continued. At this time, I am denying your request for immediate legal rights. Should you wish to pursue involvement in the future, you must provide clear evidence of financial stability, emotional readiness, and consistent responsibility. The gavel hit the table. Decision made. A wave of relief crashed over Isla. She had won. Ethan had lost. The moment the courtroom emptied, Isla let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. It's over, she whispered, turning to Liam. He smiled, placing a gentle hand on her back. You did it. But just as they stepped outside, Ethan was waiting for them. His mask of regret was gone. His eyes burned with fury. You think this is over? He hissed, stepping toward her. You think you can just take my kid and walk away? Liam immediately stepped in front of Isla. Back off, Liam warned. Ethan laughed bitterly. Of course. The knight in shining armor. His glare flickered between them. How long, How long were you waiting to take my place? Liam's jaw tensed. You left her, Ethan. No one took your place. You gave it up. Ethan scoffed. You really think she's yours now? You really think you can just step in and raise my kid? Liam didn't hesitate. If that's what Isla wants, then yeah, Liam said. I will. Ethan's fists clenched. This isn't over. Isla stepped forward then, her voice steady. Yes, Ethan. It is. For a moment he just stared at her. And then without another word he turned and walked away. She watched him disappear down the courthouse steps, feeling the last fragments of her past finally fade away. It was truly over. She was free. Later that night, Isla sat on her couch, curled up with a blanket, her mind still reeling from the events of the day. She had spent so much time fearing Ethan, fearing the weight of her past mistakes. But now there was only the future. A future that was hers to shape. Liam sat beside her, quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. So, what happens now? He asked softly. She turned to him, studying his face. The face of the man who had stood by her through everything. She reached for his hand. Now, she said, smiling softly, we write our own story. Liam's lips curled into a grin. I like the sound of that, he murmured. And as Isla rested her hand on her growing belly, feeling the gentle kick of her baby, she knew. For the first time in a long time, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Think.